Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Perfumery Basics. So in today's video, I wanted to talk about something that comes across every novice perfumer in their lifetime when they're starting off, and that is, should I or should I not pre-dilute my materials before I use them? Okay, so reason number one why you should pre-dilute your materials before you use them, and that is because the material itself that you're using, the consistency or the material thickness is just too hard or too sticky to use or draw from a pipette. And a perfect example could be, Labdanum Absolute. Trying to use this substance, let's see if we can get close in there. And you can see I'm dumping it upside down and it's not moving. It is such a sticky, solid, resinous material that trying to draw this from a pipette is nearly impossible. It's nearly impossible. So yeah, you would want to pre-dilute something like this so it's easier and thinner in consistency, so when you're drawing from a pipette, it's just that much easier. Some other materials that are like this in consistency, like galaxolide musk. The raw format of galaxolide musk is very similar to this in consistency, and a lot of online retailers that sell galaxolide sell it pre-diluted to you at 50%. So that's a bonus, or you can buy it raw yourself and pre-dilute it. Other materials come to you in crystal or powder format, like ethyl vanillin, maltol, ambroxan. Now those ones, if you prefer to use a pipette when you are blending or doing trial batches, yeah, you will want to pre-dilute those down as well. So it's just something, you can't obviously draw powder or crystals from a pipette, so it needs to be in a liquid format. So you would pre-dilute that in ethyl alcohol. Some people prefer not to though, and that's okay as well. If you have a formula that calls for, 0.1 grams of maltol, you would measure out 0.1 grams of the maltol powder and then just dump that in your beaker, and you can do that as well. That's fine. Some people prefer to work with the powder in itself raw. Some people prefer to use it pre-diluted because they like using pipettes. There's no right or wrong way with that. Reason number two why you may want to consider pre-diluting your materials, and that is to tame odor strength of the materials. So a good example could be, let's say, hedione. Hedione to me is a medium odor strength, a little bit on the weaker side. But if you're trying a blend, let's say you're trying to find an equilibrium with hedione and let's say patchouli essential oil, you'll realize one drop of each will not blend well in terms of getting the odor strength equal, like an equilibrium. So it may take like 15 drops of hedione versus only one drop of patchouli, or depending on what your blend style or what the outcome of the aroma is supposed to be. But you can definitely tell that raw patchouli essential oil is a much stronger odor strength versus, let's say, isoe soup or hedione or musk. So at that point you have to ask yourself, well, how do I make this blend so I can easier blend these two materials together and not have one drop of patchouli or any high odor impact strength material overpower my blend? And at that point you have to make a decision. You have to either decide, I'm going to increase my trial batch size, the beaker that you're working with, the actual volume that you're working with, so you can use a lot more hedione to one smaller drop of like patchouli. Or you would pre-dilute the patchouli, and what you're doing now when you pre-dilute it is you're now taming its odor strength. You're not making the aroma as strong or pungent. You're slowly taming it down depending on how further down you dilute it. Some people dilute it to 50%, you can go to 20%, 10%. That is completely up to you and how you like to work with your materials. So yeah, reason number two why someone may want to consider pre-diluting is taming odor strength versus other materials, and it's just a lot easier to balance your perfume that way. Reason number three why you may or may not want to pre-dilute your materials, and that really just comes down to cost. A lot of materials can be very inexpensive, some materials can be super expensive, And depending on the size of the trial batches that you are working with, can make or break your wallet big time. So cost is always a factor for a lot of people, because when you're purchasing materials for your perfume stash, you know, your perfume organ and your materials on hand, most DIY home, you know, perfumers are not purchasing an excessive amount of materials, like say by the kilogram or by the gallon. Mostly because they know they won't use all that material, you know, within the next few years, because a lot of materials that you do purchase have a shelf life, usually 2 to 3 years. After that, they start to turn off and smell. So cost factor. A lot of DIY perfumers are buying in such smaller amounts because they don't need an excessive amount of materials. They will buy things by, like say 15, 30, or 100 ml little bottles. So to make that material last you that much longer, you may want to consider pre-diluting these materials. So pre-diluting the materials just means not only are you taming odor strength, but you're now allowed to use a much smaller trial size batch and not burn through so much material when you're tinkering around with your trials. And what I mean by tinkering, I mean if you are building a new perfume from the ground up that is exclusively yours, it's your own concept, and you're just playing around with materials, you don't quite understand how it's going to turn out yet, but you want to test a lot of different materials and see what happens, you're probably going to want to pre-dilute it. Because if you're using things raw or neat, you're going to be using, again, an excessive amount of material, which you may not already have if you're buying your materials in such smaller quantities to begin with. So another thing is you're pre-diluting because you know that you're not going to get your formula perfect on the first try. Nobody ever does. Most perfumers, even professional perfumers, it takes them over a year to perfect a formula or for a finished perfume, and that can take 10, 15, 20, 50 plus trial batches to get to a formula that they actually enjoy or considered finished. So imagine trying to do 20 to 50 trial batches of using raw materials before you're actually happy with your perfume. You're certainly going to run through all your materials if you're buying in, you know, smaller quantities of like 50 or 30 ml bottles. You're going to burn through it like that. So one thing you might want to consider is pre-diluting the materials. Now, again, if you have a formula of a perfume that's already finished, and you know it's a complete formula, yeah, you can by all means use that formula and use raw materials, undiluted or neat. That's fine because you know that formula is finished. But if you're working on a formula that you don't know what the outcome is quite going to be yet, and you're going to be tweaking it many times down the road, you may want to consider using pre-diluted materials until you figure out that formula's working final formula. So to put this cost perspective into more perspective, I've actually did 2 demo formulas, which we're going to take a look at now. One formula, both actually are the same formula in the same format. The formula calls for parts per thousand, and we're going to look at the same materials. One will be raw undiluted materials. How much of that raw undiluted will it take to make up this formula? And then the next formula we're going to look at is the same formula, but with pre-diluted materials, and how much of that will it take to make up this one single formula. And then we're going to look at the cost behind it, how much we purchased the material for, how much we used, and how much we're actually burning through or spending to make one single formula, or trying to replicate it many times. We can look at then how many times, how much does this really cost us in the end. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so for this first example formula, we're going to take a look at, I picked out just a few random ingredients here, so please don't take this as a real formula, a real perfume formula. I just picked some random ingredients, some that are very inexpensive and some that are a little bit on the costly side. But we're going to compare this now with another formula in a little bit to show you the cost differences of using materials in their raw strength, undiluted, versus something where you pre-dilute your materials. So in this first line here, we've got our materials here highlighted in green from musk, you know, some oak moss, labdanum, pepper, vetiver, Hedione, Isoe Super, some citruses, some florals here, and just some random things. So in yellow is our actual formula. And then here's our percentages of our formula. You can see here it's very rich in Isoe Super, 45% of the formula, a lot of Hedione. We've got some Orange Blossom Essential Oil, almost at 2%, and then a couple things here like Ultrazur, which is very low amount, under 1%. So I picked these materials to show the differences between a lot of raw materials versus some that are smaller and almost trace amounts and some that are more usable. So the formula percentages are kind of all over the place. So let's take a look at now how many grams does it take to make up this formula if we used everything here at 100% raw neat strength. So you can see here how much, like say Isoe Super, to make up this formula, it takes 2 grams of Isoe Super to equal this, 451 for the formula. This is all going to total parts of 1,000 at the end. So, but then looking at something like Ultrazur, where just a single little drop of a pipette, which on average is 0.105 grams, would give us that 3%. Or I'm sorry, 0.3%, so 3 parts per thousand. So you can see here all the different weights that it takes in their raw state to equate to this here formula. So the total amount of raw materials that we're using to equal this formula is about 4.4 grams total. That's how much it actually took to make this formula. Now here in this column is called grams raw, and this is, the raw materials again because we're at 100% strength. So this column here is going to equal the same that we drew from the pipette because we're using everything raw. But now to look at this from a cost perspective, how much did it actually cost us to make up this one trial batch? So let's say you purchase most of your bottles at, little tiny 30 ml bottles, and I went online and just took an average of how much each of these materials cost if you were to purchase a 30 ml bottle. Some of these things are cheap, like Hedione. You can get a 30 ml bottle for $8. Vetiver essential oil from Indonesia is a little bit more pricier. It's about $40 for a 30 ml bottle. And if you're getting super expensive, like real orange blossom essential oil from like Eden Botanicals, a 30 ml bottle is $200. So you can see here the cost is kind of all over the place, from very inexpensive to very expensive, and then a couple things in between. And then I broke it down, how much does these materials cost per gram, okay? So if you were to use just 1 gram of, orange blossom essential oil, it actually costs you out of your pocket $6.67 versus something like Isoe Super, which is very cheap. It only costs you 17 cents per gram. So now, if we look at how many grams it took total to encompass this formula based on the cost of how much we purchased our materials for, the total cost it took right here to make up this formula using the materials neat or raw was $1.59. This is how much it actually cost, how much you spent in material costs to make up this one trial formula. Now I did a multiplier times 15 down here because most of us, when we're making trial batches, we don't get the blend perfect the way that we want the first time. It's almost impossible. I've seen perfumers do 10 trial batches, 20 trial batches. I've seen some perfumers work on their formula that they're trying to make from the ground up. It takes them years to make, and they've done 30, 60 trial batches. But for the sake of argument, let's say you took this cost and this formula didn't come out the way you wanted. Maybe it was a little too much orange blossom. It wasn't, it was too strong with this, or it wasn't enough of that. And you made multiple trial batches and kept tweaking the formula until you got it to where you wanted it. And it took you 15 trial batches. Now you take that cost, multiply it times 15, it actually cost you $23.83 to tweak this formula 15 times using the materials 100% strength raw, okay? So you're not using any of these materials pre-diluted, you're just using them raw, straight out of the bottle, undiluted. It costs you $1.59 to make this formula just once. And if you tried to replicate it 15 times or tweaked it 15 times, it cost you a total of $23.83. Now let's take a look at another formula here. We'll just blow this up a little bit so you can see it. So this is the same formula, but now we've actually gone and pre-diluted all our materials here. So now this is the same formula, the same percentages, but now if you pre-dilute your materials here, so you can see like I've taken Hedione and Iso-E Super, and if we pre-diluted it in ethanol or Perfumer's alcohol down to 50%, and took some of these other things like Oak Moss Absolute, Black Pepper, and diluted them down to 10%. Some of these we took down to 20%, and like something like Ultrazur here, which is already a super strong material, we pre-diluted this down to 1%. So we've got multiple different dilution strengths here. Now, if we were to take these same materials at these pre-diluted strengths, how much would it take now to make up this formula? So now you can see the grams here is quite different. So we're using about 5.0, we'll just round up and say 5.01 total grams. Okay, now that's including the ethanol that we added in to make this, 50%, 10%. But if you look at this column here, and we're just looking at how much of that material that we're using pre-diluted is actually just the raw material by itself without ethanol or dilutions. So now if you look at the total grams raw, you're only using 1.6 grams of raw materials, versus on the other one, you were using 4.4 grams raw material if you used it all undiluted. It's the same formula, you get the same result, but you're using a lot more raw materials, obviously, if you use everything 100% strength neat, versus the raw materials when they're pre-diluted, you're only using 1.6 grams. So now let's look at that at a cost perspective and how much money you're gonna save. The same materials here, the bottle cost for a 30 ml bottle and the cost per gram is still the same. But now the cost is gonna be less in this column here because you're using less raw material because it's pre-diluted in alcohol. So if you look at the total cost column here, to make up this batch with pre-diluted materials, it only costs you 57 cents to make up this formula once. And if you were to try to replicate it or tweak it 15 times, it only now costs you $8.61 in raw materials. Versus if you try to do this raw undiluted, you can see here, to replicate it 15 times, it costs you $23.83. Versus the diluted materials replicating it 15 times, it was only $8.61. So comparing $23 to $8, significant cost difference. And the reason for that being why some people prefer to work this way is a lot of people don't want to buy a lot of materials and have a lot of material overhead. So a lot of DIY or small-time perfumers, they're not going to buy all their materials by the kilogram, or they're not going to buy it in like 200 ml bottles. They're usually buying it in smaller amounts, like 15 to 30 ml bottles on average. So, but looking at the cost difference now, you can see you're going to burn through a lot less material by pre-diluting everything down to a lesser amount. Okay, so that wraps up this video. So in conclusion, again, there is no right or wrong way when dealing with your materials in perfumery. If you choose to use things raw, undiluted, or neat, that's fine. That's perfectly up to you. Hopefully you have an excessive amount of materials in your perfume organ to back all that up. If you choose to pre-dilute, for cost savings or better accuracy when you're using smaller trial batches, that's fine too. There is no wrong or right way to do it. So yeah, comment down below and let everyone else know how you guys prefer to work. If you choose to use pre-diluted materials or if you use things raw or neat, some of your benefits and drawbacks that you've came across by choosing either side of the path. So with that being said, until next time.